In 71 BCE, a slave named Spartacus died somewhere on a battlefield in southern Italy. His body was never identified, but Rome identified 6,000 of his followers. They were captured alive. They were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. One cross every 30 meters for 120 miles. The bodies were not taken down. They were left to rot, to be eaten by birds, to collapse into bone and leather and nothing. Travelers walked beneath them for years. The smell was a policy decision. This is what Rome admitted. The question is what Rome did that it refused to commemorate with a highway of corpses. The crucifixion of Spartacus's army was public. It was meant to be seen. But Roman punishments operated on a spectrum from spectacle to silence, and the silence concealed things that even Rome found difficult to celebrate. The deaths that had no audience, the suffering that served no political purpose except suffering itself, the violence that was not a message but a method. Roman military law permitted decimation. The word itself comes from the Latin for removal of a tenth. When a legion failed in battle, when soldiers fled, when discipline collapsed, a commander could order the unit assembled and divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The soldier who drew the marked lot was beaten to death by the other 9, his tent mates, his friends, men he had marched with, eaten with, fought beside. They killed him with their bare hands and wooden clubs while officers watched. This was not common. It did not need to be common. The knowledge that it could happen was sufficient. But when it did happen, the sources describe it briefly, clinically, as though the procedure required no elaboration. What the sources do not describe is the sound of a man being beaten to death by 9 people who do not want to do it but will be killed themselves if they refuse. The sources do not describe the surviving 9 afterward, the silence between them, the years of service remaining. A general named Crassus revived decimation during the Spartacus revolt. He applied it to 500 men who had fled battle. 50 men were beaten to death by their units. Crassus watched. Then he marched the army forward into the war that would end along the Appian Way. The connection between these two facts is rarely made explicit. The men who crucified 6,000 slaves had themselves been shown what Rome would do to its own soldiers. The violence flowed downward. Consider what happened to captured enemies who were not crucified. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves, pirates, and traitors. Enemy commanders received different treatment. Some were paraded in triumphs and then strangled in the Tullianum, Rome's ancient prison. The Tullianum was not a building, it was a hole. A circular pit carved into bedrock beneath the forum, 12 feet deep, accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered into darkness. The execution was strangulation by garrote, performed by the executioner in a space so small that the killer and the killed shared the same stale air. Vercingetorix, who had united Gaul against Caesar, spent 6 years in that pit. 6 years in darkness, in a space 12 feet across, waiting. When Caesar finally celebrated his triumph in 46 BCE, Vercingetorix was pulled from the hole, dragged through the streets of Rome in chains, and returned to the pit. Then the garrote. The sources mention this. What they do not mention is the 6 years, the darkness, the sounds from above, the knowledge of what was coming and the impossibility of knowing when. Jugurtha of Numidia died in the same pit. He was thrown in and left to starve. The Roman historian Sallust records that his last words were, "How cold your bath is." He meant the pit. He meant Rome. He took 6 days to die. These were kings. These were men whose names were recorded because their defeat was worth recording. The nameless prisoners received less consideration. Roman military camps included dedicated spaces for the interrogation of captives. The intelligence value of prisoners was extracted through methods that no source describes in detail, but every source acknowledges existed. What we know is that information was obtained. How it was obtained lies in implication. After the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 CE, the siege of Jerusalem produced horrors that even Josephus, writing for a Roman audience, could not entirely sanitize. The crucifixions outside the walls were so numerous that the soldiers began experimenting. They nailed prisoners in different positions for amusement, upside down, sideways, contorted into shapes that the human body was not meant to hold. When they ran out of wood for crosses, they did not stop crucifying. They improvised. The details are absent from formal histories. They survive in fragments, in accounts written by the victims' descendants, in the margins of texts that Rome did not control. Inside the walls, famine reduced the population to acts that Josephus describes with the detachment of a man who knows his Roman patrons are reading. A woman named Mary of Beth Ezob killed her infant son and roasted him. She ate half. She offered the rest to the rebels who came demanding food. This story was preserved because it was useful to Rome. It demonstrated what the Jews had become. What it did not demonstrate, what no Roman source examines, is what siege does to a population over months. The mathematics of starvation. The decisions that precede the unthinkable decision. When the city fell, Titus ordered the temple burned. The soldiers went further. They burned everything. They killed anyone they found. Josephus puts the number at over 1 million dead. The survivors were sorted. Men over 17 were sent to the mines in Egypt, where the life expectancy was measured in months. The younger boys were kept for purposes that Roman sources mention only in passing, with words that require no translation. The mines themselves were a death sentence pronounced in softer language. Roman mining operations in Spain, in Egypt, in Dacia consumed human beings. The silver mines of Hispania operated on labor that had to be constantly replenished because the workers died faster than they could be replaced. Diodorus Siculus describes miners working in tunnels so narrow they could not turn around, in darkness, in heat, in air that poisoned them slowly. They worked until they collapsed. They were replaced. The ore continued flowing to Rome. For the prisoners of war sent to the mines, survival was not relief. They had been captured, sorted, transported, and delivered to a death that would take months or years instead of hours. The slowness was not mercy. The slowness was extraction. If the mechanisms of suffering unsettle you, there are others we have yet to uncover. Subscribe so the next descent finds you. The arena offered death as entertainment, and Rome refined it into art. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was reserved for the lowest criminals and the most despised captives. But lowest and most despised were categories that Rome defined according to its needs. Christians, prisoners of war, slaves who had displeased their owners. They were stripped, tied to posts, or left free to run, and released into the arena with animals that had been starved to ensure aggression. Lions, bears, leopards, wild dogs. The death was not quick. The animals were not efficient. A lion does not kill like an executioner. It mauls, it tears, it loses interest and wanders away while the victim is still breathing. The crowd watched this. The crowd paid for this. The infrastructure of the Colosseum included elevators to raise the animals from underground, trapdoors to release them at dramatically appropriate moments, and drainage systems to wash away the blood between spectacles. The engineering was sophisticated. The purpose was suffering as spectacle. When animals were unavailable or uninteresting, the arena offered other methods. Prisoners were forced to fight each other to the death, unarmed, while gladiators waited to kill the survivors. Prisoners were burned alive on stakes arranged in patterns for aesthetic effect. Prisoners were crucified in the arena itself so the crowd could watch the hours of dying that normally occurred out of sight. The innovation was constant. The suffering was the entertainment. The death was incidental. But the arena was still spectacle. The suffering still had an audience. What Rome concealed was the suffering that served no purpose except to demonstrate what Rome could do when no one needed to watch. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE lasted 17 days. The city burned street by street, building by building, while the population that had not fled was killed or captured. The killing was not military. By the final days, the soldiers were clearing houses room by room. Civilians who had nowhere to go, the elderly, the sick, children. Anyone who could not be profitably enslaved was not profitably kept alive. Polybius was there. He watched. He wrote about Roman soldiers walking on rooftops made of corpses, bodies used as fill to create level surfaces for advancing troops. He wrote about soldiers throwing the living and the dead into pits together, about cavalry horses trampling bodies that were not yet corpses, about the screaming that continued for days beneath the rubble. Scipio wept, Polybius tells us. Then Scipio finished the work. Afterward, the ground was ploughed. Salt was sown into the furrows. A curse was pronounced. Nothing would grow, no one would rebuild. The city that had challenged Rome for a century would become a memory. And then not even that. The number of dead is given as vague estimates. The methods are described without the details that would make them unbearable to read. The sources give us structure without texture. We know what happened. We do not know what it looked like, sounded like, smelled like. We do not know the names. In Gaul, Caesar conducted what he called pacification. The word conceals everything. When the Veneti tribe resisted, Caesar defeated their fleet and then executed their entire senate. When the Eburones revolted, he invited neighboring tribes to plunder their territory, offering whatever they could take. The Eburones did not survive as a people. When Uxellodunum held out against siege, Caesar let the defenders surrender, then cut off the hands of every man who had carried weapons. He released them, handless, into a Gaul that was learning what resistance cost. The hands were the message, but the message was delivered through bodies that then had to continue living. This was worse than death, and it was meant to be worse than death. The survivors were warnings that walked, that begged, that displayed Roman policy in every interaction for the rest of their shortened lives. Caesar recorded this himself. He was proud of it. What he did not record was what came next. How does a man without hands eat? How does he dress? How does he survive a Gallic winter? How long does he live at all? The mutilation was a death sentence that Rome did not have to administer. Time would do the work. Cold would do the work. Starvation would do the work. Rome simply set the process in motion and moved on to the next siege. The sources preserve what Rome wanted preserved: the victories, the triumphs, the glory. They do not preserve the full texture of what victory required. Crassus, the same general who ordered decimation and crucifixion during the Spartacus revolt, later invaded Parthia. He lost. His army was destroyed at Carthage. Crassus himself was captured. The Parthians, according to Roman sources, executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. The symbolism was clear. He had been greedy for wealth. He would choke on it. This story may be true. It may be Roman invention, designed to frame Parthian victory as barbarism rather than military superiority. But consider what its presence in Roman sources reveals. Rome recorded this method of execution. Rome found it memorable. Rome found it shocking. Rome did not find its own methods shocking. The crucifixions, the decimations, the arena deaths, the mutilations, the mass killings, these were recorded without moral comment. The horror was reserved for what others did to Romans. What Romans did to others was simply war. The 6,000 crosses on the Appian Way came down eventually. The bodies rotted and fell. The wood collapsed. The road remained. Travelers continued to use it. Commerce continued to flow. The empire continued to function. And the memory of what those posts had held faded into something that could be mentioned in histories without being imagined. That was the hiding. Not the absence of record, but the presence of record without presence of feeling. The fact without the weight. The death without the dying. Rome did not bury its crimes. Rome displayed them until they became ordinary, and ordinariness is the deepest grave of all. Hidden by time.